Mr. President, I rise again today for the second time in opposition to the confirmation of Andrew Wheeler, at this time to be Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. It's not a decision I came to lightly or without considerable effort to find a different path. I want to begin my section of my remarks right now by describing some of the events that brought us to this point. First, I want to talk briefly about my own experience with Mr. Wheeler. As a staff member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, working for our dear friend, the late Senator George Voinovich, and for Jim Inhofe, Mr. Wheeler was not someone with whom we agreed on each and every issue. However, Mr. Wheeler did prove to be someone with whom we could work on policies on which we did agree. Like, for example, the Diesel Emission Reduction Act, which reduces significantly diesel engine pollution, emissions from older diesel engines. And I'd also note that his responses during and after last year's hearings on his nomination were, for the most part, encouraging. But Mr. Wheeler also has some recent professional history that is troubling, and to some very troubling. During the Trump transition, the public got a chance to read the so-called Murray Action Plan. And what is that? It's a list of policy proposals submitted to President Trump and other Trump administration officials by Mr. Wheeler's former client for a while, a fellow named Bob Murray. The Murray Action Plan includes any number of measures that EPA in the last 15 months has begun to implement, like the repeal of the Clean Power Plan and the Clean Water Rule, and the dissemination of EPA's career workforce. The document also calls for some measures that EPA has not yet acted upon. For example, Mr. Murray calls for the repeal of the mercury and air toxics standard, rules that limit dangerous pollution from power plants, even though industry is already complying with those same rules. Mr. Murray also calls for a reexamination of climate change science and the repeal of EPA's so-called endangerment finding. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the conclusion that both the Bush and Obama administrations reached that found the global warming pollution from cars and SUVs was dangerous. I think I'll just take a minute and talk about the endangerment finding right here. People talk about the endangerment finding. I don't think it's well understood where it came from. And I want to take just a moment, if I can, to try to relate it in terms that I can understand and hopefully other people can as well. If you go back to the Clean Air Act, Section 202 of the Clean Air Act says that if EPA determines that an air pollutant emitted from motor vehicles endangers public health or welfare, EPA has to write regulations to control those emissions. Has to write regulations to control those emissions. I believe it was in 1999 that environmental organizations petitioned EPA to do just that. And they asked EPA to determine that greenhouse gas pollution from motor vehicles was dangerous. And President Bush rejected their position in 2003, saying that greenhouse gases did not meet the law's definition of an air pollutant. The state of Massachusetts led a coalition of other states and environmental organizations, though. They filed a lawsuit against the Bush administration's decision. In April, I think it was 2007, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Massachusetts and those who filed with Massachusetts. The court told EPA in 2007 that greenhouse gases are, quote, air pollutants, close quote, under the Clean Air Act. And they went on to say that the EPA had to determine whether they were dangerous. Although President Bush's EPA administrator, Steve Johnson, was ready to make the so-called endangerment finding for greenhouse gases being emitted from cars and SUVs, the White House would not let him do it. The White House would not let their own EPA administrator make that finding. So it wasn't until a year or two later, I think it was December of 2009, that the Obama administration's EPA finalized its determination that greenhouse gases from motor vehicles are dangerous. And in 2010, EPA and the Transportation Department issued the first joint fuel economy and greenhouse gas tailpipe standards for cars and SUVs. In the meantime, many industry groups tried to overturn EPA's decisions. They filed suits in a number of different federal courts saying that those groups did not agree with the climate science. They didn't agree with the process that EPA used to arrive at this endangerment finding. And they didn't like the regulation that EPA was writing in 2009. Well, 2 or 3 years later, 2012, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, that's the top appeals court in the whole country, right below the Supreme Court. But anyway, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against the industry, upholding both the endangerment finding and the EPA's clean car rules. And the Supreme Court declined to take up the industry's appeal. So it stood. The U.S. Court of Appeals essentially sustained what EPA under the Obama administration sought to do, and what Steve Johnson, who was the EPA administrator in the Bush administration the last year or two, sought to do. So what does all this mean? What this means is this is settled law. The highest courts in the land have said greenhouse gases are air pollutants, they are dangerous, and EPA must regulate them. Now, with that as a backdrop, let me just say I met with Mr. Wheeler a couple of times in the last year. I asked him directly, whether or not he was involved in writing Mr. Murray's proposal, the so-called Murray Plan that has been taken as an action plan by this administration, by this EPA under its current administrator. Mr. Wheeler assured me that he was not. He was not involved in writing Mr. Murray's proposal. He did go on to tell me, however, that one of Murray Energy's priority issues that Andy Wheeler actually worked on was securing health and other benefits for retired miners, and I think that's something that most of us would support. However, moreover, Mr. Wheeler also assured me that he views EPA's legal authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, which is based on the endangerment finding, as settled law. Let me say that again. Mr. Wheeler assured me that he views EPA's legal authority to regulate greenhouse emissions, which is based on the endangerment finding, as settled law. I have no reason to doubt Mr. Wheeler's assurances that, at least on the question of the endangerment finding, he holds a view that is distinct from Bob Murray's. And that's a good thing, at least to me. However, I'm sure that I speak not just for myself when I say I do not feel similarly assured by Administrator Pruitt. The Trump White House has said that it wants EPA and the Transportation Department to negotiate what I like to call a win-win on CAFE and tailpipe standards with California. That means the Trump administration's policy must be to leave the endangerment finding alone, because the endangerment finding is what gives EPA and California the authority to write the tailpipe greenhouse gas rules in the first place. But Administrator Pruitt has repeatedly refused to say this clearly. For example, in last July, he told Reuters that there might be a legal basis to overturn EPA's endangerment finding decision. And when I asked him in late this January, to commit not to overturn it for as long as he is administrator, he refused to make that commitment. In preparation for Mr. Wheeler's confirmation, I tried very hard to obtain some clarity about just what EPA plans to do with regards to the endangerment finding and the agency's stated efforts to negotiate new greenhouse gas vehicle standards with California. My staff and I talked to Bill Wareham. He's the EPA Administrator for Air. Important job. And with Ryan Jackson, Administrator Pruitt's Chief of Staff. We spent several weeks exchanging drafts of a letter that EPA planned to send me that sought to do three things, to make clear three things. First, the letter affirmed the legal authority EPA used to find that greenhouse gas emissions were dangerous and set vehicle standards. That's number one. Second, the letter affirmed California's Clean Air Act authority to set its own more stringent vehicle standards. And third, the letter committed to negotiate in earnest with California, using a process not unlike the one used in past efforts, to preserve a single national set of vehicle standards that automakers in California could support. A true win-win. We actually reached agreement on the text of that letter, those who were negotiating it, including Mr. Wareham, his team, folks from California, and others. I'm told that Administrator Pruitt initially agreed to let the letter be sent. But then I'm also told that just days, maybe a week or two ago, that a woman named Samantha Travis, political appointee at EPA who I think is from Oklahoma, who recently resigned after reports that she failed to come to work for some or all of 3 months last year. Anyway, apparently she convinced the administrator to renege on the deal and not to sign the letter. So ultimately, a significant part of the reason why I cannot support Mr. Wheeler is because the agency refused to follow through on an agreement it had made with me on issues that are of real importance to the country and to the auto industry and to California. But the truth is, at this point in time, it's not the only reason why we should be moving forward with this vote. In the past several weeks, each day brings headline after headline. Here they are again. This is just a handful of headlines. This is a target-rich environment in terms of headlines from Scott Pruitt. But in the past couple of weeks, each day brings headline after headline, scandal after scandal, report after report about the simply, I think, unconscionable manner in which Mr. Pruitt is running the agencies. I talked about it earlier. There have been dozens of calls for his resignation. They've come from members of both parties here in the House. Speculation about how long he'll be able to remain in the job. It is a very high pitch, very high pitch. It's entirely possible that Mr. Wheeler might be sworn in as acting administrator before he spends a single day on the job as deputy administrator. We'll see. And the truth is, we've never really had the opportunity to ask Mr. Wheeler how he would remedy the reports of excessive spending out of EPA under Mr. Pruitt's leadership, inappropriate travel, retaliation against staff who dare to cross him, unlawful rule repeals, and other gross abuses of power that Mr. Pruitt has inflicted on this country. If it was suddenly Mr. Wheeler's job to right those wrongs, which it will be if he's confirmed today. Neither Mr. Wheeler nor members of the Environment and Public Works Committee were even aware of the extent of many of these problems, scandals, when his confirmation hearing was held more than 5 months ago in the Environment and Public Works Committee. And simply, in my view, the Senate today quite simply should not vote on his confirmation until we know which job Mr. Wheeler will be filling at the agencies, and until we know how he views and how he would remedy the overwhelming number of serious problems he will face when he arrives there. Let me just say one last thing, if I could, Mr. President. I'm a big believer in win-win situations, win-win solutions. I think my colleague who's presiding at this moment is too. And we partner on a variety of things, including trying to promote recycling, not just here in this body, but all across the country, in ways that create jobs, create economic opportunity. I focus a lot, and I think a lot of my colleagues do, on how do we create a more nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation. We don't create jobs here. Governors, presidents don't create jobs. We try to help create a nurturing environment for job creation. One of the elements that's important for having that kind of nurturing environment for job creation, frankly, is clean air and clean water and good public health. Another thing that's important is certainty. Businesses like certainty and predictability. I'll never forget when, oh gosh, it's been 10 years or more, I was visited by a bunch of utility CEOs from all over the country. And they had come to talk with me and my staff about clean air legislation, covering 4 distinct pollutants. They included mercury, CO2, nitrogen oxide, I think maybe one more. It's multi-pollutant legislation, four pollutants. Anyway, I had introduced legislation on the heels of President Bush's proposal. President Bush proposed multi-pollutant legislation that he called Clear Skies. The version that I introduced with a Republican colleague or two, we called our version Really Clear Skies. SOx, NOx, mercury, CO2, that's what it was, those four pollutants. Anyway, we had these CEOs from these utilities across the country that came to see us. They wanted to talk about our legislation to ratchet down over time the emission of those pollutants from their utilities. We talked for about an hour. And at the end of the hour, Mr. President, one of the CEOs of a utility, I think it was from the southern part of the country, and he said, look, let me tell you, Senator, here's what you should do to me. Here's what you and your colleagues should do with respect to air emissions for utilities. He said, tell us what the rules are going to be, give us some flexibility, a reasonable amount of time to meet those expectations, and get out of the way. That's what he said. Tell us what the rules are going to be, give us a reasonable amount of time to meet those expectations, some flexibility, and get out of the way. With respect to CAFE, what we're doing with fuel efficiency requirements for cars and SUVs, trucks, what we need is the same kind of, what I need to keep in mind is providing the same kind of certainty and predictability for the auto industry here in this country and outside of this country, as we expect them to increase fuel efficiency over time for cars, trucks, and vans. Under the current law that we adopted, gosh, I want to say about 10 years ago, we ramp up fuel efficiency requirements up through 2025. And between 2021 and 2025, the increases are pretty significant, pretty steep. Current administration wants to almost eliminate entirely those increases between 21 and 25 and really be silent on what happens after that. I go to the Detroit Auto Show almost every year. In Delaware, until a couple of years ago, we built more cars, trucks, and vans per capita in Delaware than any, believe it or not, any state in the country. And I got used to going to the Detroit Auto Show, so I know the people who ran Chrysler and who ran GM, so if they ever thought of closing a plant in Delaware, we'd actually know who to go talk to. So I still go to the Detroit Auto Show most years. And I went this time and met and talked with representatives of 10 auto companies from this country and from around the world. And we talked about CAFE and fuel efficiency requirements going forward. To a company, this is what they said to me in private conversations. We need some flexibility in the near term between 2021 and 2025. And in return for that additional flexibility, we are willing to accept tougher goals extending out as long as 2030. So near-term flexibility, longer-term requirement for more rigorous standards. They said, having said that, we don't want to have to be stuck in a situation where we have to build like one car with higher fuel efficiency requirements, so let's say a model of a car or truck or SUV, with higher requirements for fuel efficiency for California and another different standard for the rest of the country. That just doesn't work for their business model. And they need to be able to build one model with one set of standards for California and the other 49 states. California wants to, where they've had huge air pollution problems over the years, wants to have rigorous requirements. And I said this to the majority leader earlier this week. There is a way to work through all of this with the auto industry, California, the other states, with EPA, the Department of Transportation. There's a way to work through all of this that provides a real win-win, that preserves jobs in the auto industry, people building cars, trucks, vans, is respectful of California's special concerns, provides the certainty and predictability that the industry needs, and also ends up giving us more energy-efficient vehicles, cleaner air and cleaner water, especially cleaner air. That is a real win-win situation. That's a real win-win situation. And that's where we need to go. And we need leadership at EPA. We need leadership from the administration, leadership here, from states like California, to get us there. Wayne Gretzky was a great hockey player. And I'm not a huge hockey fan. I watch it a little bit, but Wayne Gretzky, when he was playing, he was believed to be the best hockey player anybody ever seen, at least here in this country. And his nickname was the Great One, the Great One. Somebody went out, and he took a lot of shots. He was not shy about shooting for a goal. He was once asked, Mr. Gretzky, why do you take so many shots on goal? And he said these words. He said, I missed every shot I never took. I missed every shot I never took. I like to take the shot in a lot of different respects. This is a shot we should take. And if we do, we'll do a lot more than score a goal. We'll score a big win for our country. We'll save, in the end, people who are driving cars, trucks, and vans in the years to come a lot of money. And we'll have cleaner air, and we'll protect a lot of jobs that need to be protected and preserved. And with that having been said, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.